Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zubko. Today we're going to speak about the EU engagement in Afghanistan. We will critically review its role and mission with Dr. Oz Hassan. Hello.
Hello.
Oz is a reader of national security in the Politics and International Studies Department at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. His research focuses on transatlantic relations with the Greater Middle East, and he is the author of the European Parliament's Committee on Foreign Affairs study entitled Afghanistan: Lessons Learned from 20 Years of Supporting Democracy, Development and Security, which provides further guidance on how the EU can continue delivering support and assistance to Afghanistan. It is the only official lesson learned study for the EU, and it makes 32 recommendations to inform parliamentary resolutions and the European Commission. There is also a book published in September 2024 titled Why the European Union Failed in Afghanistan, Transatlantic Relations and the Return of the Taliban. And this book was my primary motivation why I invited Dr. Hassan for this interview to speak about the European Union more deeply. And in terms of educational episode that we are developing right now, we want to research few implications that we can learn from the EU involvement in Afghanistan. So let's start with the first question. How did the EU's reliance on the Bonn Model lead to a fundamental misjudgment of Afghanistan's political and social complexities, and what alternative models could have been considered?
Okay, I mean, obviously the Bonn Model, the Bonn Agreement, was the agreement sort of conducted in 2000, the late 2001 through to 2002, and it basically set up a model for Afghanistan to be a centralized government. So effectively to have a strong centralized government that sort of replicated what we would understand as a sort of modern state structure. So that's the sort of starting point. What the Bonn Agreement sort of set in motion, however, was, and many EU makers refer to it as the original sin, is it actually set into motion a process of centralization that proved very problematic because it didn't resonate with Afghan norms and Afghan culture. So in the book, for example, the first two chapters are historical because they sort of provide a deep contextualization of Afghanistan through what Barry Buzan and Little refer to as three stages of the international system. So, you've got the pre-international stage, development of international systems, and the sort of modern stage. Afghanistan doesn't fit into any of those in the sort of European way. So what effectively happens with the Bonn Model is they try and impose a system that does not fit the Afghan norms. Rather, in terms of what the alternative could be, Afghan history suggests, and culture and norms, for example, suggest that a more federal model would have been more suitable. And there were various reasons that the European Union and the United States especially sort of went down that route. In part, the United States didn't want to sort of create a sort of Yugoslavian model or a sort of Balkanization of Afghanistan, thinking through the sort of ethnic diversity of the country. And so the European Union, in many ways, sort of nested itself within US strategy and kind of adopted what the US was doing. So that centralization model became key to everything that went wrong subsequently.
And do we know why that centralized model was considered? Because there's a logical question, like you have scholars, you have policymakers, you have historians, and all those scholars all together and all the experts, and suddenly we have the question about the fundamental misjudgment. So is there any notion that we can maybe research why that Bonn model was based on that consideration of centrality?
Yeah. So in part, you have got the sort of experience, the sort of European experience, Eastern European experience of sort of saying like, okay, we don't want a sort of fragmentation to
Mm,
happen. That was very much part and parcel of the American thinking. There was no evidence that that would happen in Afghanistan, and
mm,
anyone who's familiar with Afghan history would know that certainly since the 17th century, that you know since the rise of Pashtun nationalism and sort of a Pashtun awareness, it's unlikely that Afghanistan would have done that and sort of fractured in that way, just because the last 3 centuries of history and so forth. However, I think what your question's pointing at is really important, because what it's sort of saying is, what was the sort of other underlying thinking, and this kind of gets to the hub of the issue, in that centralization was preferable, because actually what they'd done is both the United States and the EU and member states um, approached Afghanistan as if it was a blank slate.
mhm.
They approached it on the basis that Afghan history did not matter, that actually, the conflict throughout the sort of Cold War and the end of the Cold War had left Afghanistan so decimated that there was no conception of civil society. There was no sort of set of actors that could necessarily be worked with. And so you can approach it as if history did not matter. And what that meant was that they came in with a model of statehood and state governance structures that they thought they could just sort of overlay and build a state on top of. And so that becomes the sort of secondary sin, if you like, after the Bonn Agreement, that actually the removal of historical contextualization means that there was no attempt to fully understand, integrate, or empower Afghan communities that do not fit the European model at all. And so that's kind of that was one of the key strategic mistakes that the book highlights.
That basically sounds like, oh, we have some blueprint and we are bringing it to you, so you should accept it. But you know what? We're not going to ask that many questions about your society and how you want that blueprint to work. So that's quite interesting. Also, there are two concepts, democratization and security, that the EU was working with. And is it possible to explain why the EU was emphasizing more on democratization and or why overlooking the Afghanistan's sort of need for security as well?
Yeah, so it's interesting because at the European Union level, obviously there's no sort of military structure. So democratization and democracy programs sort of rose up to the top. In terms of member states, the book points out, that at the high point, which I think was around, let me think, it was around 2011, there were about 34,000 EU member state troops, predominantly from the UK, but sort of split between within Afghanistan. And of those, by the end of the sort of conflict, I think it was something like 800. Well, I know exactly what it is. It's 857 EU troops died as a result of the conflict. But so at the member state level, the security part was done in and through NATO. And so everything was sort of deferred to NATO, and the transatlantic relationship was primary. What that meant was that the EU, as a set of institutions, was kind of marginalized very much in 2001. And as member states began to, and so one of the things it did focus was on development and democracy as a result of that marginalization. and of course, and in part because of the history throughout of EU involvement in Afghanistan through the 1990s. Um, it basically positioned itself as the sort of humanitarian and development actor where democratization became the long-term strategy because it just simply didn't have the crisis management tools to deal with it. And then, but interestingly, it then sort of European actors basically gave up strategic autonomy and said, actually, we are going to let the United States run this strategy, tell us kind of, what the overall direction is, and work with the United States as it sort of begins to undertake its counterterrorism operations, and then that turns into nation building and so forth. So in part, to answer the question directly, it is that democratization was a product of initial European Union marginalization. It was the European Union was geared up because it had the correct instruments to do that it had developed throughout the 1980s and 1990s. And increasingly, the EU, certainly within the first 2 years, just simply did not see the security problem arising because there was a sense that the United States had won the war, and that state building in that sense would work.
So the EU basically considered Afghanistan as a post-conflict territory that needs some sort of governance. That was the main idea. And why this assumption was cemented by the EU leaders? Was it because they wanted to make the process quicker?
It was largely in part because the way the United States designed the initial conflict and the way member states operated in the conflict meant that the EU was entirely marginalized. So there was this mini diplomacy that sort of happened where actually member states back in 2001, 2002 effectively said to the EU as a sort of overall body, we'll deal with this and you can kind of come in and do a few small things but not really be a main actor. What's important about that is that you had like the EUSR, the European Union Special Representative Mechanism, and Kleiber was the first of the EUSRs, done a good job in terms of trying to get Afghanistan onto the collective EU table, if you like. Vendrell was a very sort of effective actor when he took over in 2002, in that he was able to, because of his experience in Afghanistan prior to that, he was able to sort of pull things in. So in other words, for the first part of the conflict, the member states marginalized the EU's ability to actually engage, and so democratization became the default. What began to happen later on is that as the member states began to get fatigued and tired, that then meets the period of the Lisbon Treaty. So obviously, the EU becomes a different sort of foreign actor, international actor under the Lisbon Treaty. It's not until that period that marginalization stops and the EU begins to sort of take over more formal responsibilities and act collectively.
And when you speak about EU members, I think it's quite important to explain what was the mood among member states. Were they all supporting that sort of movement to establish a centralized governance in Afghanistan? Or were they some members they were strongly opposed? And you know how the EU is operating. There are supranational level and there is a national level of decision-making process, especially in foreign policy. So what was that sort of movement inside of the European Union when it comes to Afghanistan?
Yeah, it's a great question, because actually, if you read the unfoldings of the Bonn process, it was the Europeans that were actually not moving towards democratization at all. The European idea was actually maybe what we should do is reinstate the monarchy. So the Europeans were very much like, okay, well, what would happen if we bring back the king, and the king acts as a sort of overall monarchy that then begins to help transition this process because he's still highly respected. I mean, that Vendrell was very keen on that idea, and sort of promoted that one, if I'm recalling correctly. The Americans were absolutely adamant that wasn't going to happen. I mean, at that time, they were still talking about or starting to talk about the freedom agenda, and sort of, the idea at that point comes from a paper, a sort of, I think it's still a sort of top secret paper, but people have sort of spoken about it, called something like the Delta of Terrorism or something, that talked about, if you overthrow countries, you can create this great big wave of democratization and so forth. So the Americans were sort of on that bench, but it was actually the Iranians who introduced the idea of turning Afghanistan into a democracy at the Bonn process. It was Iran's idea to kind of go, why don't we make it more democratic? Which is, not what people would expect given the narratives around Iran and so forth. So it was conflicted in that way. So the European approach, in part, sort of said that actually there needed to be a more transitional way of doing these things. The Americans opposed it. Where the sort of disagreement really flourished behind the scenes was on the issue of counterterrorism. So the United States obviously wanted to respond in a way that conflated terrorism and warfare, and hence we got the war on terror. But the EU experience with terrorism throughout the 1970s onwards, certainly, and under the Trevi framework and so forth, was actually that you respond to terrorism as if it's a criminal offence. So you bring two very different ideas of justice there. One is, the sort of cowboy sense of justice from the United States, where you go and hunt people down. The United States was actually, the EU actors were certainly like, actually, let's sort of, bring legal processes in because we don't want to get involved and bogged down in precisely what happened. So what that meant was that there was this sort of divergence at the sort of counterterrorism level, but because the EU was marginalized at the beginning and then ultimately didn't want to challenge or undermine transatlantic solidarity, and because the United States is was the most powerful actor in the international system, that's the sort of unilateral moment. They sort of fell behind it. And so what that actually meant was that the EU wasn't really able to kind of steer the conversation. It was more led into the conflict rather than anything else.
That's very interesting. And I think the next question is quite logical. And is it possible to summarize the interest of the European Union that the Union wanted to achieve in Afghanistan by establishing that sort of model of governments?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one, because it was very, very vague for a long time over exactly what the European Union was trying to achieve. It wasn't really until the 2010s that the EU came out with the clearest statement that it can. And that was that it was going to build a centralized state that was able to function on its own, and have enough resilience to carry on over the long term. And so that became part of this idea of, the transitional moment after, part of the great decade or great transition that Afghanistan was supposed to be going through up until 2024. That was part of the thinking. So the EU very much did end up defining its objectives in the long term, which was really different to the way in which the United States was doing it. And so, when as part of the parliamentary report, um, I was able to interview a lot of actors, very senior actors, and sort of talk to them directly as part of that sort of testimonial process. And one of the biggest observations that came out from talking to both people in the United States and the EU, so very senior actors in both zones, in both parts of that transatlantic relationship, was that they fundamentally had a different understanding of the length of time it would take to do what they wanted to do in Afghanistan. The United States was working on a framework where it would be out of Afghanistan by about 2004. And the EU was very much our long-term development strategy is that we are going to be in Afghanistan for decades and decades, and that this was a long-term partnership. And this goes back to what the interests are, because for the United States, the geography means that, you haven't got the same sorts of interests. For the United States, counterterrorism was number one. And beyond that, nation building became a sort of secondary adjunct, and then that sort of turned into the state building and so forth. The EU, on the other hand, has not just and this was true of the 1990s as well, when the Taliban first came about. Not only defined its interests in terms of proliferation and terrorism, but also migration. So it was a case of sort of saying, actually, the geographical proximity means that when migration occurs, irregular migration, when irregular migration occurs, it is also linked to organized crime in Europe. It's linked to the trafficking of small arms, sex trafficking, modern day slavery, and so forth. So the nature of the interests is subtly different because of the geography.
Oh, so when we speak about imposing some sort of governance model to a state like Afghanistan, naturally we have another question, and this question is related to the history. Like, is there any successful model that the EU has already done this? Because when you watch documentaries about Afghanistan, and when you go through the tribes, through the country parts of Afghanistan, the differences are huge.
Yeah.
And it's not only differences in the society, religion, but also about how people understand the life.
Or not. This was a real tension between the delegation and Brussels centrally. It was a real big tension because the contextual information that was coming from the delegation, was not being responded to. In fact, folks at the delegation who were interviewed throughout the period, I won't say which period because I don't want to sort of give their identity away, very much felt that the papers that were being received in Brussels were not being read. And that actually, it was this giant ship in Brussels that just simply had a vision of the way in which state building was done, and it wasn't going to change that. It was just too big a ship to turn around. If I can point, you asked for a model. I'm going to switch that slightly on its head because the book makes the point about contextual consonance and contextual dissonance. And they are sort of theoretical tools that I use to basically say, does what the EU is doing, or does what a foreign actor in its foreign policy do, resonate with the conditions on the ground or not? And so to do that, I engaged in a sort of deep contextualization. And what's really interesting about Afghanistan is historically, for millennia, as European sort of, as the rest of the world is growing up in one direction, you get Afghanistan having the Indus civilization. What's interesting about that is it's the only civilization that we know, large civilization that lasted over millennia that we know, um, that does not fit into the historical direction and travel of development that others did, in that there was no hierarchy. So the archaeology of it sort of reveals that there were no sort of palaces, there were no churches that were sort of centralized authorities, but yet these complex societies were able to be formed, and these complex cities were able to be formed through heterogeneous negotiation. So what's interesting about that is it implies very early on throughout the sort of development of the international system. At this point, it's actually international systems, because that's there's, they're not connected at that point, but that actually that civilization has power so dispersed amongst it that it kind of sets the sort of precedent for things that happen later on. I mean, the only reason that civilization faded away was actually environmental. There were a range of environmental factors that led to the Indus sort of collapsing. And so what the book sort of says is that, okay, so there's something really interesting going on there, that actually you can kind of reflect Afghan society backwards and kind of go, the context of this place is so different that actually the uniqueness, the Afghan, a sort of Afghan exceptionalism has to be taken into account when you are trying to develop a state in that way. So there's that sort of historical context, that much broader historical context of the way in which the global system's have been developed, and the way Afghanistan's related to it. But then, of course, also the more modern history of what was conducted in the 1980s. I mean, in the 1980s, as a result of the Soviet invasion, the United States made the deliberate decision that they would make Afghanistan ungovernable. So, in effect, to try and break the sort of social agreements and so forth that held and built, that kept it as a sort of singularized, or the possibility of becoming a state entity. So what's interesting about that is, by the time you get to sort of the 2000s, to take out both that longer term historical context and the more immediate context, and not learn lessons from the 1980s and 1990s, is incredibly problematic. And ultimately it leads to such a large range of problems that the EU, as well as the United States, just simply can't engage with Afghanistan in a meaningful way, that meant that the Taliban weren't able to take advantage of it.
Yeah, the history is something we must study, because otherwise we're just working like with experimental ideas almost. So let's continue with the next question, Oz. From the point of view of the crisis management, you need some tools when you want to implement governments and new regulations and everything. And I think many students and also junior researchers might ask the question, like, what was the process of implementing those tools? You have a plan coming from the EU, and you have Afghanistan, where everything is fragmented, and as we said, history is very rich. So what was happening after? Like, should we imagine this, that some people from the EU came to Afghanistan and they were saying, like, you will do this like that, and you will do this like that? Or how was the process? Because I think this is something that almost all of my students, they would be interested in.
Okay, so it's a really interesting way in which the EU has developed its relationship with Afghanistan. So I'm going to add a bit of contextualization. You sort of get the invasion in 79, and in the 1980s, the EU as an actor gets so marginalized that it has no crisis management tools. and isn't allowed by member states or the United States to act. So throughout that period, it develops a sort of, so, you know, by the time you get to sort of mid 1980s, 1990s, you've got the EU funding different humanitarian agencies on the ground, often sort of European, with European sort of connections and so forth. And that builds up this sort of network where actually the UN sort of says that it's leading on the humanitarian stuff, if you like, the humanitarian approach in Afghanistan in that period. But actually the EU, because of its funding model, because of its connections and everything else like that, it becomes the de facto leader. So it by default, it's kind of able to circumvent the UN and get action done on the ground. That's its sort of overall approach. So then you get 9/11, and the United States comes in and sort of says, you know, like that our military approach is the way forward. We're going to take over. And so, you know, throughout all of this, I should add that, you know, the EU is a fairly minimal actor in this compared to the United States. The United States is as one US official referred to themselves, they are the gorilla in the room, right? They are able to sort of push and shove and make things happen because they've got the military power to sort of turn up with $6 million in various bags and make things happen, right? So what the EU does is, at first, it uses the European Union Special Representative mechanism. So Kleiber kind of goes over, and all he can really do is try and get conversations going with the transitional authority. So the folks who are sort of, you know, leading up to that first election, and the EU in that respect done very well because it was able to get things on the agenda and sort of, you know, it used its agenda setting power, if you like. But that was really it in terms of crisis management, because it didn't have a military. It had no ability to sort of instigate its own autonomy. Vendrell is able then to sort of really sort of knuckle down on that process and becomes a much more successful actor. So the EU at this point is punching well above its weight in terms of what it's doing. As the member states get tired, they then use sort of, you know, go, okay, well, what about if we have this sort of centralized police force with EUPOL that wasn't very successful at all. So in terms of actually making things happen, at that point, the EU is really divided and quite ineffectual because you've got, you know, the EUSR sitting in one place, in another place, in Kabul is the money and so forth. And it's really divided. Then what happens is the EU kind of consolidates and creates what they call this double-hatted position, where the EUSR effectively becomes very central in terms of actually being able to control everything and sort of have a say in how the EU acts. And so by the time you get to Melbourne, who was probably the most successful actor in terms of output, in terms of EU actors, was the most successful in terms of what he was able to achieve. Because once you've got that consolidation from the Lisbon Treaty, they were able to kind of negotiate and push for various things. So you had the Brussels Conference, which was really pushing to make sure international attention and aid was refocused. So this is in 2016 at this point. Aid was refocused. You also had the EU, in particular Melbourne, leading on what is still a very controversial peace building operation, where actually he was able to sort of get a peace agreement between Hekmatar and and the government, and sort of get him removed off the the UN terrorist watch list and so forth. In fact, that's probably the only successful peace building operation, and it was led by the EU. What the EU doesn't highlight it, because a lot of actors within the EU are still upset that it occurred. And there was a lot of tension over how that happened. So it's not sort of highlighted. But in terms of, so it moved from agenda setting to actually being able to pull people together and get operations done. Where it was sort of, on the ground, if you like, with EUPOL, it was very ineffective because it wasn't able to get enough international backing or from the region. The region very much saw this as the EUPOL as a European operation. They weren't able to staff it properly. The leadership turnover was very frequent, and in the end, it kind of just became ineffective.
One of the characteristics of the EU foreign policy is that EU likes to establish various funds around policies and ideas. And we know that there was the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund. And there are a few sort of inconsistencies around this. And many say that there were corruption, some inefficiencies in aid distribution, and some problem with the staff. So how was that situation based on your research, and what sort of remarks you can share with us?
Basically, international aid was being stolen and used for corruption. And that's not a sort of contested thing. EU actors were able to see that that was happening, but chose not to challenge corruption throughout most of this period of time, because they felt it was more important to have a international partner that they could work with. And so corruption in that sense went unchallenged. Now, the EU was not the primary actor in this, because the way in which the United States was doing international development was so problematic that it actually caused what's now referred to as the corruption eruption. The amount of aid being flown in, and literally flown in bags, into Afghanistan was at such an astronomical level that it outstripped Afghanistan's GDP in various points, like over 100% sort of coming in compared to GDP. So the corruption was so widespread. Now, this kind of goes back to the Bonn Agreement as well, in that the Bonn Agreement empowered the warlords, which were the very same warlords that were committing human rights abuses in the 1990s. That were the same reason that Afghans wanted the Taliban or were able to tolerate the Taliban in the 1990s, because they didn't want those warlords behaving in that way. What happens under the Bonn Agreement is those people come in. So, of course, once they're in power, they then build nepotistic networks. And basically, they had no incentive to build a state, a centralized functioning state, because they were busy enriching themselves. So there's all sorts of complications that arise because of corruption and the way in which international development was done. So, like excessively large amounts of money ended up in bank accounts in Dubai. So I think one of the estimates I read was, at customs. So as things are coming in, for every $2 million sort of dollars trying to get its way into Afghanistan, 1 million would end up in bank accounts in Dubai, another million in the country itself. It was that sort of bad. You had more typical sort of development agencies sort of even they're sort of saying that the level of corruption is much higher in terms of what they're willing to tolerate in losses to corruption was much higher than in other places. And this is a really interesting phenomenon because international aid, the amount of it became the indicator for success. So there was a period in time where the United States was saying of the European Union, well, and European member states, well, you're not pulling your weight, you're not doing enough, and so forth. So the European Union, as a proxy, said, well, okay, well, the amount of international aid we give can show you the level of our commitment. What that didn't do, of course, was actually look at how useful that aid was. So, today, Afghanistan is one that has such excessive levels of poverty beyond the cities that such a large international aid program surely couldn't justify itself. How do you give a country that amount of aid that's comparable to the Marshall Fund that Europe received? How can you give it that amount of aid and still have that level of poverty throughout the country for what is not a very populous country to deal with that? And the answer is the corruption was so prevalent and so overlooked that it was actually a cause of the problems, a large amount of problems.
I think that's a big warning for the next EU engagement to be more transparent with the money and try to do something about it, because we have the instruments, but from what you said, it looks like there was not political will to tackle that sort of corruption.
It was felt that cooperation with the Afghan authority, the Afghan government, was more important than tackling corruption. Again, that was actually a major tension between the delegation, the USR, and Brussels. That's brought out more in the book and the parliamentary report, because it was one of the key findings of the parliamentary report.
Also, let's speak a little bit about neighbors. When you try to do something in whatever territory in the world, you always consider a region, not only a country. So how would you evaluate, maybe what would be your remarks about EU engagement with the neighbors of Afghanistan, especially when we speak about Pakistan, we speak about Iran and others, because that's crucial.
Yeah, this was a really big issue. So the European Union developed its regional strategy for Central Asia in sort of the late 1990s, early 2000s, and it's that part of that was the main focus of it was that it was really about trade and aid. So trade was number one, and then there were various forms of aid. But actually, the relationships were very, very thin. Now, as Kleiber comes in 2001, 2002, as he reports, he basically spent most of his time telling regional neighbors that they're not welcome, that actually this is an American sort of venture. The European Union is backing the Americans, and so actually they should sort of stay out a bit. So obviously they were a bit more involved in the Bonn Agreement and the Bonn negotiations and so forth, as Iran was. But what's interesting over time is the EU then works out that it needs those regional powers, but those regional powers then turn around and say, "No, this is too American. It's too American led. We've been pushed out for so long that actually we're perfectly happy with this situation, because we're just going to circumvent Afghanistan, because Afghanistan at this point just becomes for its neighbors becomes a sort of regionally it's understood as just this sort of void where terrorism and all sorts of regional problems happen." Problems happen that then spill out into the region. It's not somewhere they wanted to necessarily go and get involved in. And that becomes a real problem for trying to find solutions by the time you get to the second decade of the conflict. Because at that point, regional powers aren't particularly interested in solving this, because in many ways they've worked out that this is a US problem and that actually it's bogging the United States down. And they're perfectly happy with that. It's kind of like a sort of, you broke it, now you need to fix it sort of way of engaging. Obviously, there's differences. For example, Pakistan has had its sort of policy of strategic depth in Afghanistan, which is one of the main problems that's been had. In fact, such a prevalent problem that some EU actors basically said it was the United States and the EU on one side of the conflict, and it was the Taliban and Pakistan on the other side of the conflict, and that really it was the fact that Pakistan continued to aid the Taliban that effectively led to the Taliban's return.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I can't imagine to impose a sort of government system and having not support of the neighbors, because that particular state, it doesn't matter if Afghanistan or other state, is going to interact with neighbors at the first sort of front. And then you have the international cooperation and global issues. So that's quite interesting information. Also, one of the cross-border issues is, and I think was, drugs and narcotic trade. During the process when the EU tried to impose the centralized governance in Afghanistan, how was this question taken or tackled by the EU?
So, Britain was supposed to lead on the counter-narcotics front. So part of the original marginalisation of the EU was that member states said, well, we'll do this and we'll do that. So, Germany done the security sort of police force stuff until the United States was very unhappy because they didn't do it right. And then the United States came in and couldn't do it either. Italy was supposed to do sort of constitutional stuff, but Britain was really the counter-narcotics down in Helmand. What was interesting about that is that the Afghan government said they'd very much tackle it and they'd sort of get on top of it and so forth, but weren't able to make a dent in it because effectively you had this circular illicit economy building up where it was very profitable to maintain the production of drugs, right? What's interesting about that is that there was a real tension between the development side and the counter-narcotics side. So, for example, there were examples where, irrigation systems would be made for farming. And then the Brits would notice that British troops weren't getting targeted in certain places as they were building irrigation systems and things like that. And then, of course, it transpires it's because that irrigation system wasn't being used for, the farming of crops or so forth. It was being used as a sort of dual use for growing poppies. And therefore implicit in the heroin trade. Similar things began to happen in terms of paying for protection for, as people moved, you'd pay companies to protect you and so forth. And so that the development side and the security side began to interact in that complex way. So they were never able to get on top of drug production. Today, the drug production, however, has by and large stopped. It's the only thing, because in the same way in the 1990s, the Taliban were able to sort of say, actually, we're not going to allow that. And then it stopped. They've done the same today. And so the illicit drugs trade in Afghanistan has decreased as a result of the United States and the and European powers leaving NATO.
The next cross-border issue is immigration. And this is very complex topic, and I fully understand that we can have an episode about it. But perhaps you can briefly summarize how the EU approached that immigration issue and the sort of desire of people to escape Afghanistan as a territory.
Yeah, this one is complicated because there's been various stages, where Germany, for example, at one point very much welcomed Afghan refugees. However, with the rise of populism, by the time you get to sort of 2016, migrants are being pushed away from Europe because it's fundamentally changing the internal dynamics of the European Union, because it's far right organizations are able to leverage the politics of migration, irregular migration, especially, but also asylum, and talk about the way in which that's creating an ontological threat to, the nature of the European character and so forth. So the response from the European Union has been subsequently that actually this process needs to push Afghan migrants out. I don't think we've got to a solution yet because, of course, the way in which that's now being dealt with is that Germany, for example, is very much sending people back. And so there's a real tension. No one has sort of solved this conundrum yet, and it is one that that will increase over the years.
Let's move for a little bit to global and international arena and the perspective from that level. And I have two questions, and maybe you can answer them in sort of your way, how you want it. And that's the first one is, during that process, what was the reaction of Russia and China as two countries that were getting closer together? And the second question, Central Asia as a region and Afghanistan, and then you have the Caucasus. So it's a very complicated region in terms of geopolitics and international relations. What was the response to that EU process and EU style of implementing central governance from the Central Asian countries and from the Caucasus?
Yeah, I won't claim too much expertise on this because the book doesn't really touch on it because of the way in which the European Union didn't seek to cooperate with them. However, there was a concerted, there was a sort of sense in which they were sort of onlookers into the situation and willing to agree to the extent in which it conflated, there was a confluence of interests. So, for example, for Russia, it was a case of going, okay, we agree with what you're doing in Afghanistan in terms of counterterrorism because we also have a Chechen problem. And actually aligning Chechnya with the war on terror and sort of using some of that discourse and the way in which you're talking about how you're dealing with terrorism is quite useful for that. So there was a whole range of things like that was sort of going on where there was a sort of mutual acceptance over that. And the reason I sort of phrase it that way is because every time there was an international peace agreement or an attempt at a peace agreement, it would always fall apart. So even when John Kerry finally sort of agreed, we'll talk to, the Taliban and opposing sides will sort of agree to that and so forth. Any steps that were made towards peace building, when they included international actors, just collapsed. So there was no agreement around peace building. There was no agreement about the future of Afghanistan from the Russians, the Chinese, from the Caucasus or so forth, because it was just seen as just too complicated to get an agreement and too American-led. And so there was a sense in which they were very happy just to sort of let America kind of get bogged down. The Chinese were slightly different in that China has always sort of had a sort of pragmatic approach to Afghanistan. And you can see that today. So China is, for example, the first country to really engage and acknowledge and recognize the Taliban today. And that's because China sort of says, okay, now the United States, NATO have left, we can try and negotiate different mining agreements with the Taliban so that we can get access to rare earth minerals. I mean, throughout history, Afghanistan has always needed to invade other countries. So during the sort of 18th, 19th century, basically the Durrani Empire would sort of go and conquer other parts of what is now Pakistan, parts of Iran, and so forth, and then sort of take the wealth of that to prop it up because it has no internal wealth. So therefore, in the 19th century, it relied on Afghanistan relied on Britain to sort of prop up the sort of central sort of elements. Then by the time you get to the early 20th century, that becomes Germany. Then that becomes the Soviet Union. And then it becomes the United States. And now they're left without anyone and the economy is floundering because there is no external source of revenue. What's interesting about the current state of technology is that Afghanistan sits on such a large amount of rare earth minerals and metals and so forth that it's able to sort of talk to the Chinese and say, actually, irrespective of all the archaeological problems that there are with digging up over there, that could possibly provide you with the sorts of things you need to make, new batteries to create, the technologies that are going to help us solve global warming. So Afghanistan all of a sudden has got a sort of centralized form of income, but of course that's complicated by the relationship the Taliban has with the rest of the world.
The mining and minerals and everything is all sort of mystery because the transparency is not there. So who knows which companies are going to really profit out of these natural resources. Also, the last question for today's interview. I think that there are many lessons that the EU can learn from this process and based on your research and research of other scholars. But if you could pick one lesson that you would sort of present to the EU leaders to learn, what that lesson would be?
Okay. So in my parliamentary report, there are 32 lessons, but the one I would point out the most is that you cannot engage in international development at the exclusion of peace building, because that will create such a level of insecurity that you won't be able to do or fulfill the objectives of international development. So, i.e., don't do international development and in an insecure environment if you're not also working on peace building initiatives. And that means you have to talk to people that you aren't comfortable talking to.
Oz, many thanks for your remarks, insightful thoughts about Afghanistan, and that you're doing exceptional research, because the book and report and everything is just pointing out that we should really research Afghanistan and the EU relations in much better scale and try to get some creative research themes and try to address the real problems of Afghanistan. Because as I said, you just turn on YouTube and you watch few documentaries about Afghanistan and you have the picture of the complexity of the country based on the society, on the religion, on the leadership. Now we have Taliban. Also the EU-Taliban relation is slightly unknown, as I say. So this needs some research. Anyway, thank you for being on IR Think.
Thank you very much.